say thank you for coming, and I would like to introduce Bernie Koning, who's going to introduce our speaker for the day, Judy Rebick.
Thank you. It's always great to get applause before you put on your show. Anyway, when I heard Judy was going to be here today, I had to say I have to introduce her, because Judy and I were cohort workers together in the pro-choice movement some 25 years ago, and it's just great to see her again. Since then, she has done all kinds of things, great activist. Some of you may be familiar with rabble.ca, an alternative news station online. You must get that to get some really great perspective on the news. She was one of the first people to stand up at the G20 to protest the police actions there. She's been involved in all kinds of stuff, and I don't want to talk too long because then I'll take up the whole thing and she won't get to speak. But she's going to be talking about her recent book, Transforming Power, From the Personal to the Political. Great book. Everybody should read it. She's going to read from it today, so please welcome Judy Rebick.
Well, first of all, happy St. Patrick's Day. Unfortunately, we're allowed to have booze here. I know you're all there. You like to be at the bar, but I'll try and be as entertaining as possible. Maybe, oh, yes, I have to bring something. Whoa. Too loud. So I'm not going to read from my book. I'm going to talk about people's movements around the world and a little bit in Canada. And the first thing I want to do, the first slide, is how many people know about the revolutionary movement in Egypt? Okay. And how many people know about the upsurge in Madison, Wisconsin? Okay. That's good, that's good. Okay, so I have the two pictures here, and I'm showing you the two pictures because what happened in Egypt is very dramatic and important, and it's going to change many things in the Middle East and in the world. For one thing, it completely changes the dialogue about the war on terror. It makes Islamophobia much more difficult because here we have a movement of people who are mostly Muslims. In fact, religious Muslims. If you see the pictures, you'll see on Friday they're all praying in the square. But they're not looking for an Islamic state. They're looking for a secular democratic state, and they defend the rights of the Christians just as the Christians defend their rights. And so they're undermining this dialogue that has created much of the war, that has justified much of the wars that we've experienced in the last 10 years by undermining the idea we have of Islam, that it's fanatical, that all Muslims want to have a religious state, that they want to wipe out the West and wipe out Christians, that they're anti-democratic, that they're authoritarian. And it wasn't any argument that did that. It was people, tens of thousands of people going into the streets to demand democracy, to demand a democratic, secular state. And so what we have is an amazing example of people's power. Now, because they're demanding democracy, our governments have to kind of support them. Because, after all, we're supposed to be supporting democracy in our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It would be interesting if, at the end of this process, Afghanistan and Iraq turn out to be the only countries in which there isn't viable democracies. Which proves that the way to get democracy is not to bomb people, but to support movements of people who want a say. And in Egypt, it's very inspiring. I'll talk about it more as we go through. They've won many of their demands in the revolutions preceding. As you know, in other countries, it's been more complicated, particularly Libya. And we can talk about that in the question period. But it's also interesting that about 1/10 as many people know about what's been happening in Wisconsin. Because a very similar thing is happening in Wisconsin. Now, they have democracy in the United States, such as it is. But what they don't have is any rights for working people. And the few states that continue to have the right to unionize, like Wisconsin, Ohio, and so on, mostly in the Midwest, states that were central to the labor movement and the industrialization of the United States in the 1930s, these states that continue to have those rights are now under attack. And the governor of Wisconsin, who's a Tea Party person, he brought in legislation which he claimed was to fight the deficit, but in addition to asking for cutbacks to social benefits for unionized public sector workers, which, by the way, the union agreed to, he also brought in a series of anti-union measures that would basically make it impossible for unions to continue to survive. Making the goals to make Wisconsin like the southern United States, where unions can't organize at all because the rules are so tough to organize. But something happened in Wisconsin that was different, and that is people started to fight back. Tens of thousands of people came into the streets of Wisconsin, not unlike Tahrir Square. In fact, even the numbers were similar at the beginning. Last Saturday, there was 100,000 people in the Capitol in Madison, Wisconsin. 100,000 people, which, given the population of Wisconsin, is not so different of how many people were in Tahrir Square. And it's spreading across the United States. Been in Ohio, in Michigan, and last I heard there was a massive rally in Tennessee for union rights. And it's not just union members. Students are involved. And what you see there in that picture is the Capitol building, kind of like maybe our House of Commons lobby. And those people have been occupying the Capitol building for 3 weeks. They were thrown out last week. For 3 weeks, living there day and night, occupying it, a combination of unionists and students demanding their rights. We haven't seen anything like this in the United States, they're going to say since the 60s, but we didn't have union struggles in the 60s. Since the 1930s. Now, wouldn't you think this has some relevance to us here in Canada? I don't know about here in London, but I know our mayor in Toronto, who you may have heard about, wants to privatize public services, wants to attack the unions. At the federal level, they're being a little more cautious about it, but nevertheless, the whole attack on the public sector unions is coming. In Canada, too, exactly the same thing. And yet, our media doesn't report about Wisconsin. They report about Tahrir Square, because as far as they're concerned, Tahrir Square is only about democracy. But actually, that's not true. Go to the next slide. Because what we hear in the media, in the mass media, the mainstream media, is that the democracy movement in Egypt was spontaneous. People just got fed up, and then this guy got killed in Tunisia. So they went into the streets, and it was a miracle. That's not true at all. There's been organizing going on in Egypt for 3 years, at least 3 years that we know about. And in particular, there were two movements that were very central. One was the April 6th movement. And there's their logo. The April 6th movement, which has been organizing now for, I think, since 2008, when there was a textile strike in Egypt, people were fighting for their rights in the textile movement, and this group of students and young people in Cairo supported them. And they started organizing on Facebook. Solidarity with the textile workers. And by the time January 25th came, which is the day that was called for the first protests in Egypt, they had 10,000 people on their Facebook site already. There was another group in Egypt that was called, I should always write this down. Anyway, there was another, the We Are All Khalid movement. And that was a young man, a year before, a young man in Alexandria was killed by the secret police. And this was a movement to protest. They also had about 10,000 people on a Facebook page. So when they started to organize for January 25th, they had already connected 10,000 activists, 20,000 activists. Well, I'll say there's some overlap, I'm sure. but over 10,000 activists that had already been organizing in very small conditions, much smaller conditions, without mass support. And then the young man in Tunisia set himself on fire, and they called a demonstration, and everybody came. It was, in the 60s, you used to have this expression, seize the time. None of the young people who organized this had any idea that this would happen. They just wanted to protest and demand democracy. And as you see, the April 6th movement already had the demand for freedom. And you also see the raised fist, which is sort of the universal symbol of the left, you know, and the people's movements. And what about in the US? How come all of a sudden the labor movement's radical in the US? It's been so conservative for so long. Even when Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers in the 70s, and some of you may have read about that if you take anything on union history. When Ronald Reagan came into power, there was an air traffic controller strike, and Ronald Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers. Now, if you're going to fire a group of people, that is not the best group to fire, because they're trying to skilled workers. Not easy to replace them, but he showed right off how fierce he was going to be, how fierce an opponent he was going to be against the unions, that he was prepared to fire the air traffic controllers and take the consequences. And as a result, the labor movement was intimidated by that and didn't fight back. And so we had this sweep of anti-labor legislation, particularly across the south of the United States, what they called the right wing's very good at names. They called it right-to-work legislation. Sounds good, right? You want to have the right to work. But really what it means is the right not to be in a union and not to have unions in your workplace. And that's what the right-to-work legislation is. And today, in states in the United States, some states you make $3 or $4 an hour minimum wage. There are people working in supermarkets in Florida and all over the south of the United States making $3 and $4 an hour minimum wage. Because there's no unions, so very few unions. So what happened? What happened? What happened? The labor movement suddenly woke up? No, there was also organizing going on. Because a lot of people in the United States, there's a huge number of immigrant workers, a huge number, what we call, and we have this in Canada too, precarious workers. A restructuring of the workforce to get rid of industrial jobs, most of which have gone overseas. And if you've seen any Michael Moore films, like Seen Roger and Me, or one of those films, you'll know about that. And they've deindustrialized the United States in a very real sense. And what's left are service jobs, most of which are part-time, many of which, and very low-level industrial jobs, many of which are being done by immigrant workers, domestic jobs. And then you have, on the other scale, you have a sort of professional class that has become very, very wealthy. So this huge gap between rich and poor. And many of the poor are precarious workers. They're working at 2-3 jobs to make a living, plus taking care of their family, and they don't have anywhere near the social supports that we have here. And so a number of people said, we have to organize these precarious workers. Well, the unions weren't willing to do it. So people set up worker centers all across the United States to organize poor and immigrant workers. There was one union called SEIU that organized janitors, called Janitors for Justice, and started having actions of janitors, not the usual workplace action, but things like they'd walk through an airline terminal to let people know about how poorly paid they were being as janitors. So there was all this organizing going on under the surface, which led to a U.S. social forum in Atlanta in 2006, and then one in Detroit last year.